He didn't give her a home. He gave her a tomb. A decaying stone fortress at the edge of the world, meant to swallow her alive so he could drink and gamble in London without the nuisance of a wife. The Duke of Westford bought a bride to settle a debt, then exiled her to the damp, forgotten halls of Oakhaven. He expected her to weep. He expected her to break. Instead, Rosalie picked up a scrub brush. This is the story of a cold bargain, a ruined castle, and the woman who built a fire big enough to thaw a duke's frozen heart. The ink on the parish registry was not even dry before Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Westford, made his intentions clear. He did not pull Rosalie into a secluded alcove to whisper promises of a shared future. He did not look at her with the softening gaze of a newlywed. He stood in the vestibule of St. George's, fastening his riding gloves with precise economic movements. "My carriage will take you north," Arthur said. His voice was gravel and old smoke. He did not look up from his gloves. "The journey is roughly 5 days. Oakhaven is secluded. You will find it peaceful." Rosalie stood in her altered 5-year-old silk gown. She felt the heavy, nervous sweat of her father standing 2 paces behind her. Her father, a viscount who had gambled away everything but his title, had sold her for the exact price of his debts. Arthur had paid them. In exchange, Arthur received a respectable, quiet bride who asked for nothing, which checked the final box his aging, tyrannical mother had demanded before her death. "You're not coming, Your Grace?" Rosalie asked. Her voice was steady. She prided herself on that. Arthur finally looked at her. His eyes were the color of a winter sea, gray, turbulent, endlessly cold. A fading scar cut through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a war he never spoke of. "I have affairs in London. An allowance will be sent to the estate quarterly. The steward, if he is still alive, knows how to reach my solicitor." He turned on his heel. "Good day, Duchess." That was the entirety of their honeymoon. The carriage ride north was a steady descent into isolation. As London's smog gave way to the rolling green of the Midlands, and eventually to the jagged, unforgiving moors of Yorkshire, Rosalie felt the last remnants of her old life stripping away. She was 22. She was married. She was entirely alone. It rained on the 5th day. It was not a gentle, romantic drizzle, but a driving, bitter sheet of water that turned the carriage path into a river of dark mud. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt, Rosalie peered through the water-streaked glass. Oakhaven loomed against the bruised sky like a rotting tooth. It was a medieval fortress clumsily retrofitted a century ago and abandoned for the last 30 years. The iron gates were rusted into a permanent sneer. Ivy choked the stonework, creeping up the mullioned windows like thick green veins. Half the slate tiles on the roof were missing, leaving the timber skeleton exposed to the violent weather. The carriage driver handed her down, his eyes carefully averted. He deposited her 2 meager trunks on the wet stone steps, tipped his hat, and drove away. He couldn't leave fast enough. Rosalie stood in the rain. She grabbed the heavy iron ring of the door and pulled. It groaned, a deep, agonizing sound of rusted hinges, and gave way. The entry hall smelled of wet soot, rat droppings, and decades of stagnant air. Dust lay so thick on the checkerboard marble floor that it muffled her footsteps. Above her, a massive chandelier hung precariously from a rotting beam, shrouded in dense spider webs. "Hello!" she called out. The word echoed off the damp stone, mocking her. From the shadows, a woman emerged. She was small, bent like a shepherd's crook, carrying a flickering tallow candle. She squinted at Rosalie. "Who's there? We ain't got nothing to steal. Best be off." "I am Rosalie," she said. She squared her shoulders. "The Duchess of Westford. I am your new mistress." The old woman let out a dry, rattling wheeze that might have been a laugh. "Mistress of what? The damp? I'm Mrs. Gable. My husband Marcus is out back, trying to keep the barn from collapsing on the last mule. The Duke sent you here to die, then?" It was a blunt question, a brutal one. Rosalie looked around the cavernous, rotting hall. The chill was already seeping through the thin soles of her leather boots. Arthur had not sent her here to die. He simply did not care if she did. He had purchased a piece of furniture and stored it in the attic. "He sent me here to live," Rosalie said, her jaw tight. "Show me to a room with a working hearth, and bring a broom." The first night was a brutal lesson in endurance. Mrs. Gable led her to a bedchamber in the east wing. It was the only room where the roof hadn't entirely surrendered to the elements. Still, the air was freezing. The fireplace, choked with decades of bird nests and debris, smoked violently when Marcus Gable tried to light a meager fire, forcing Rosalie to extinguish it with a pitcher of stagnant water. She spent her wedding night wrapped in her damp traveling cloak, shivering beneath a velvet canopy that smelled strongly of mildew. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind scream through the gaps in the stone. The rats scratched furiously behind the wainscoting. She allowed herself exactly 1 minute to cry. A single, ragged sob tore from her throat. She pressed her knuckles hard against her teeth to stifle the next one. Crying was a luxury for women who had someone to wipe their tears. Rosalie had no one. When the gray, watery dawn finally broke, Rosalie threw off the cloak. Her joints ached from the cold. She walked to the cracked wash basin, cracked the thin layer of ice that had formed over the water, and splashed her face. She opened her trunk. She bypassed the silk dresses and muslins her father had scraped together for her trousseau. She pulled out a heavy woolen walking dress, simple and unadorned. She tied a linen apron around her waist. She pinned her hair up tightly, securing it with plain iron pins. She walked downstairs. The silence of the castle was oppressive. Mrs. Gable was in the kitchen, hopelessly poking at a smoldering log. She looked up, startled by the sight of a duchess in an apron. "Your Grace, we don't have much for breakfast. Stale bread, some hard cheese." "It will do," Rosalie said. She took a bite of the hard bread, her mind working furiously. "Mrs. Gable, how many habitable rooms are there?" Habitable?" The old woman scratched her chin. "Depends on how much you mind the rain. This kitchen, your room upstairs, maybe the old library if you don't mind the draft." "And the staff?" "Just me and Marcus, and a local boy, Peter, comes up to chop wood when we can pay him." "Where is the Duke's quarterly allowance kept?" Mrs. Gable laughed, a bitter sound. "Allowance? There hasn't been a coin sent up this road in 4 years. The Duke's father stopped it before he died, and the new Duke never started it. Marcus and I survived by selling apples from the orchard in the village." Arthur's words echoed in her mind. An allowance will be sent. A lie. Or perhaps sheer negligence. He truly had forgotten this place existed the moment he inherited it. Rosalie set down her bread. She felt a cold, sharp anger bloom in her chest. It was a good feeling. It was far better than despair. She went to her bedchamber and opened her small jewelry box. Inside rested a double strand of pearls. They had belonged to her mother. They were the only thing of true value her father had not managed to gamble away, and only because Rosalie had sewn them into the lining of her mattress for 5 years. She marched down to the stables. Marcus Gable was trying to mend a rotted harness. "Saddle the mule, Mr. Gable. I am going to the village." The village of Moor's End was a cluster of stone cottages huddled together against the wind. The locals watched with outright suspicion as a young woman in a plain wool dress rode in on a sway-backed mule. Rosalie did not shrink from their stares. She found the local bank and mercantile, run by a stout, shrewd man named Mr. Higgins. She placed the pearls on his wooden counter. They gleamed softly in the dim light. "I need an account opened in the name of the Duchess of Westford," Rosalie said clearly. Higgins picked up the pearls, his eyebrows rising. "Real and heavy, but pardon me, Your Grace, Oakhaven is a cursed pile of rubble. What are you doing there?" "I am living there," Rosalie said, "and I am repairing it. Mr. Higgins, I need these pearls appraised and converted to credit. I need a roofer. I need a master sweep. I need 2 strong maids who aren't afraid of dirt. I need lye, beeswax, 50 yards of thick wool, salt pork, flour, and a glazier." "Sorry." Higgins looked at her. He saw the sharp set of her jaw, the rigid posture. He didn't see a frightened girl. He saw iron. "It'll cost you half the worth of these pearls just to make 3 rooms watertight, Your Grace." "Then we will start with 3 rooms," she said. The next day, the real work began. The real work. Rosalie did not stand by and point fingers. When the chimney sweeps arrived to clear the monstrous flues, she was there, hauling away buckets of black soot. When the local maids, Mary and Jane, arrived with scrubbing brushes, Rosalie knelt on the stone floors beside them. Her hands, once soft and pale, blistered and cracked. The lye soap stung furiously. At night, she rubbed her raw skin with mutton tallow, her muscles screaming in agony. They stripped the rotting velvet curtains from the windows, letting the pale northern light flood into the rooms for the first time in decades. They burned the mildewed carpets in a massive bonfire in the courtyard. The smell of decay was slowly replaced by the sharp, clean scent of lemon oil, beeswax, and wood smoke. She commandeered the kitchen first. It was the heart of the fortress. They scrubbed the massive stone hearth until the bricks showed red again. They polished the copper pots until they gleamed like new pennies. Rosalie, who had watched the cooks in her father's house but never touched a bowl, learned to knead dough. The first time the scent of fresh baking bread drifted through the stone corridors, old Mrs. Gable actually wept. By the end of the first month, Rosalie had calluses on her palms. She had a persistent smudge of soot on her cheek, and she had 3 rooms that were entirely beautifully warm. She sat in the library one evening. The roof above it was patched. The fire roared cheerfully in the grate. The drafty windows were covered by the heavy practical wool she had bought in the village. It wasn't opulent. It was rustic, heavy, and deeply comfortable. She dipped a pen in ink and pulled a sheet of cheap paper toward her. "Your Grace," she wrote, "the quarterly allowance has not arrived. I assume an oversight on the part of your solicitor. I have liquidated a personal asset to cover the immediate preservation of the estate. The roof over the east wing is repaired. The kitchen flues are clear. Please arrange for 20 pounds of linseed oil, a crate of nails, and 50 pounds of coal to be sent via the next freight coach. Yours, Rosalie." She sealed it with plain wax. No pleas, no complaints, no mention of her blistered hands or the freezing nights. Just facts. 200 miles away, in the stifling heat of a London gentleman's club, Arthur Pendleton read the letter. He sat in a leather wing-back chair, a glass of expensive brandy in his hand, surrounded by the murmur of aristocrats betting on horse races and gossiping about mistresses. The air was thick with cigar smoke and hollow laughter. Arthur looked at the cheap coarse paper in his hand. He read the words again. "The roof over the east wing is repaired. I have liquidated a personal asset." He frowned. He had expected the letters to come eventually. He had expected desperate, tear-stained parchment begging to be allowed back to London. He had expected accusations of cruelty. He had even expected her father to show up at his townhouse, demanding better accommodations for his daughter. Instead, he received a bill of materials and an accusation of an unpaid allowance. He called for his solicitor the next morning. The solicitor, a nervous man named Finch, stammered through the ledgers. "Yes, Your Grace. The Oakhaven allowance was suspended by your late father. You never gave the order to reinstate it." Arthur felt a strange, uncomfortable prickle in his chest. Guilt? No, Arthur didn't do guilt. But he felt a sense of dishonor. He had sent a young woman to an isolated ruin and accidentally starved her of funds. And yet, she hadn't died. She had sold her own property to fix his roof. "Reinstate it," Arthur snapped. "Send the back pay with interest, and send whatever she asked for. Linseed oil and nails." Autumn bled into winter. At Oakhaven, the transformation was accelerating. The infusion of Arthur's back-paid allowance changed everything. Rosalie did not spend a single coin on silk or frivolities. She hired local carpenters to reinforce the collapsing eastern stables. She bought massive quantities of firewood. She commissioned the village weaver to make heavy, vibrant rugs to cover the cold stone floors. A rhythm settled over the castle. The deep, heavy silence of the ruin was replaced by the sounds of life, the clatter of pots in the kitchen, the rhythmic thud of an axe chopping wood in the courtyard, the bleating of 3 sheep Rosalie had purchased to keep the grass in the bailey short. Rosalie found she liked the routine. She liked waking up before the sun, breathing in the crisp, freezing air, and going down to the warm kitchen. She liked the way Mary and Jane looked to her for direction, not because she was a duchess, but because she worked harder than anyone else. She was no longer the frightened girl in the altered dress. She moved with a sharp, undeniable authority. Her face had lost its aristocratic pallor, kissed by the wind and the sun into a healthy, vibrant flush. She wrote to Arthur once a month. The letters remained strictly operational. Your Grace, the orchard has been pruned. The apple yield paid for a new iron stove for the servants' quarters. The western boundary wall collapsed in the last storm. I have hired masons to rebuild it. In London, Arthur found himself waiting for the letters. It was an absurd habit. He kept them in a locked drawer in his desk. Whenever he returned from a mindless ball, sickened by the sycophants who fawned over his title, or from a night at the tables where he won and lost fortunes without feeling a thing, he would read her dry, practical reports. The eastern stables will no longer collapse. The north chimney is cleared. He tried to picture her. He realized with a jolt that he barely remembered her face. He remembered she was small. He remembered she wore an ugly dress. He remembered she had not cried at the altar. He tried to picture her managing a team of rough Yorkshire masons. He couldn't. It baffled him. By December, London was swallowed by a bitter, biting frost. The Thames began to freeze. Arthur sat in his lavish townhouse staring into a roaring fire, surrounded by velvet and gold leaf. The house was immaculate. It was warm. It was completely, utterly dead. He pulled out her latest letter. Your Grace, winter has set in early. We have stockpiled enough wood to last through February. The Great Hall is currently sealed off to conserve heat, but the library and the east wing remain quite comfortable. Arthur looked at the words, quite comfortable. He thought of the gaping, rotting wound of a castle he had abandoned her in. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He walked to the bell pull and yanked it violently. His valet appeared moments later, looking startled. Pack my trunks, Arthur ordered, his voice tight. Your Grace, are we moving to the country estate in Sussex? No, Arthur said. He looked out the window at the gray London sky, a sudden fierce curiosity burning through the icy numbness that had gripped him for years. Have the carriage prepared for rough roads. We are going to Yorkshire. The journey north was a punishing exercise in misery. By the third day, the sky over England had turned the color of a bruised iron skillet, dumping relentless waves of heavy, wet snow across the roads. Arthur's carriage, built for the smooth cobblestones of Mayfair, struggled violently against the rising drifts. Twice, the footman had to hack ice from the wheels. The driver, a Londoner who viewed anything north of Cambridge as barbaric wasteland, begged to turn back to a coaching inn. Arthur refused. He sat in the velvet-lined interior, wrapped in a heavy bearskin rug, drinking cheap brandy from a silver flask. The cold seeped through the floorboards, biting at his ankles. He stared out the frosted glass at the desolate landscape, a creeping sense of dread settling in his gut. He was a fool. That was the only logical conclusion. He had read a few terse letters written on cheap paper and let his imagination run wild. We have stockpiled enough wood. What did that even mean? 10 logs? A dying girl huddled over a smoking ember, hallucinating comfort as she froze to death. Arthur remembered the state of Oakhaven when he had last seen it as a boy. Water pouring through the ceilings, black mold creeping up the tapestries. It was a dead place. He had sent Rosalie there as a punishment, not to her, but to his own conscience, burying the transactional ugliness of his marriage as far from his daily life as possible. If she were dead or dying of consumption, it would be entirely his fault. On the evening of the 6th day, the carriage finally ground its way up the steep winding path to the Yorkshire moors. Arthur braced himself for the sight of the rotting iron gates. He expected them to be frozen shut, choked by dead vines. Instead, as the carriage pulled to a halt, the driver easily pushed the heavy iron. It swung open without a groan. The hinges gleamed black in the twilight, thick with fresh grease. Arthur stepped out of the carriage. The wind immediately cut through his heavy wool coat, but he barely felt it. He was staring at the castle. It was not a silhouette of ruin. Smoke, thick, white, and steady, poured from 4 different chimneys, whipping into the dark sky. The snow in the courtyard wasn't a treacherous drift. It had been meticulously shoveled into neat mounds, creating a clear stone path to the heavy oak double doors. Against the western wall, cord upon cord of split firewood was stacked with mathematical precision under a freshly built timber lean-to. It didn't look like a tomb. It looked like a fortress, bracing comfortably for a siege. He walked up the stone steps. He reached for the heavy iron ring, fully expecting to have to throw his shoulder against the rotting wood as he had done in his youth. The door gave way smoothly, swinging inward with a soft click of a well-oiled latch. Arthur stepped across the threshold. The entry hall, the massive cavern he remembered as a damp, echoing crypt, hit him with a wall of solid, fragrant heat. The smell of decades of rat droppings and stagnant water was gone. In its place was the scent of beeswax, wood smoke, and something rich and savory roasting on a spit. The marble checkerboard floor was completely free of debris, the dark squares gleaming darkly in the firelight. The chandelier, once a rusted death trap, had been lowered, cleaned, and refitted with thick, slow-burning tallow candles. A massive fire roared in the great hearth, devouring a log the size of a man's torso. "Wipe your boots, please. Mary just swept the stone." Arthur froze. He turned toward the sound of the voice. She was standing at the base of the grand staircase. For a second, his mind struggled to reconcile the woman in front of him with the pale, silent girl he had abandoned at the altar. Rosalie wore a dark blue woolen gown. There were no bustles, no lace, no velvet ribbons. It was the dress of a woman who worked. A thick white apron was tied tightly around her waist, a smudge of white flour dusting her left hip. Her dark hair, which he vaguely remembered being styled in intricate, rigid curls on their wedding day, was now pulled back in a severe, practical braid, though several loose strands had escaped to frame a face that was vividly, undeniably alive. Her cheeks were flushed from the heat of the house. Her eyes, dark and sharp, met his without a flinch. She held a clipboard and a stub of a pencil. She did not curtsy. She did not gasp. "Arthur," she said. She tested his name on her tongue as if it were a foreign word she hadn't spoken in a decade. "You did not write to say you were coming." "I am the Duke of Westford," Arthur said, the defensive arrogance kicking in automatically. "I do not need to announce my arrival at my own property." Rosalie looked at him. She looked at his expensive, snow-dampened coat, his polished boots dripping muddy water onto her clean floor, and the exhaustion lining his face. She didn't look intimidated. She looked mildly inconvenienced. "Of course not," she said evenly. She turned her head. "Marcus, the Duke's carriage is outside. Have the driver pull it around to the east stables, the east ones. The roof on the west is still waiting on slate. Tell Mary to prepare the blue room. Light the fire immediately." A grizzled older man scurried out from a side corridor, staring at Arthur with wide, terrified eyes, before ducking his head and rushing out the front door. "You employ Marcus Gable to handle my prime carriage horses?" Arthur asked, stepping further into the warmth. "I employ Marcus Gable to keep this estate breathing," Rosalie replied, tapping her pencil against the wood of her clipboard. "He knows how to handle a horse. Take your coat off, Your Grace. You are dripping on the rugs. The local weaver spent a month on those." Arthur unbuttoned his coat slowly, feeling entirely unmoored. He had expected weeping. He had expected fury. He had prepared a dozen cold, aristocratic dismissals to shield himself from her righteous anger. Instead, he felt like a trespasser. He felt like a man who had walked into a stranger's home and muddied their floors. Rosalie took his heavy coat, her movements brisk and efficient, and hung it on a wooden peg near the fire. "Have you eaten?" she asked, not looking at him. "No." "Then you will eat in the kitchen," she said. "The dining hall is sealed for the winter. It takes a forest of wood to heat it, and I refuse to burn our reserves so you can sit at a 50-foot table by yourself. Follow me." She turned and walked down the hall. Arthur, the Duke of Westford, a man who commanded drawing rooms and terrified politicians, stood in silence for a moment. Then he followed his wife. The kitchen was a revelation. It was easily the warmest room in the castle, heated by a monstrous stone hearth and a newly installed black iron stove. Bundles of dried herbs, rosemary, thyme, sage, hung from the massive oak rafters, perfuming the air. Copper pots, hammered and gleaming, hung in perfect descending order on the stone walls. At a heavy wooden table in the center of the room sat Mrs. Gable, snapping green beans into a ceramic bowl. When she saw Arthur duck his head to enter the room, she dropped a handful of beans on the floor, her face draining of color. She scrambled up, her chair scraping violently against the flagstones, and executed a trembling, clumsy curtsy. "Your Grace," she stammered. Arthur looked at the old woman. He recognized the terror. It was the same terror his father had instilled in the servants, the fear of an unpredictable, wrathful lord who could ruin their lives with a stray word. Before he could speak, Rosalie stepped between them. It was a subtle movement, but deeply deliberate. She placed her body as a physical barrier between the Duke and the housekeeper. "Mrs. Gable, that will be all for tonight. Go check on Jane. I'll plate the stew," Rosalie said, her voice dropping into a gentle, reassuring register that Arthur had never heard before. The old woman nodded frantically and vanished through the scullery door, practically running. Arthur frowned. "Does she think I'm going to strike her?" "She thinks you're going to throw her out into the snow," Rosalie said, walking to the iron stove. She picked up a thick cloth to grasp the handle of a heavy cast-iron pot. "Your father sacked half the staff in the middle of a blizzard 20 years ago because his soup was cold. People around here have long memories." Arthur flinched. He hated the comparison. He hated that it was true. "I am not my father." "You are a ghost," Rosalie said flatly. She ladled a thick, rich beef and root vegetable stew into a deep ceramic bowl. "You left them to rot. To them, your return means the end of the peace they have scraped together." She set the bowl down on the scrubbed wooden table. Beside it, she placed a thick slice of crusty bread and a plain iron spoon. She pointed to a sturdy wooden chair. "Sit." Arthur sat. He looked at the food. It was peasant fare. In London, his meals were delicate, architectural creations of French sauces and imported game, served on silver platters by men in livery. He picked up the spoon. He tasted the stew. It was phenomenal. It was hot, deeply savory, and tasted of earth and fire and survival. He ate the first half of the bowl in a silence, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. Rosalie did not sit with him. She stood on the opposite side of the table, wiping down a wooden cutting board with a damp cloth. She moved with a steady, relentless energy. Arthur watched her hands. During their brief wedding ceremony, he had noticed her hands. They had been soft, pale, aristocratic things, trembling slightly as he shoved the heavy gold band onto her finger. The hands gripping the cleaning cloth were unrecognizable. The knuckles were thick. Across the back of her left hand, a vicious, shiny burn scar tracked up toward her wrist. Her palms, when she turned them over to wring out the cloth, were yellowed with thick calluses. Her fingernails were cut brutally short. He felt a sudden, sharp tightening in his chest, a physical ache. "What happened to your hand?" he asked. The roughness of his own voice surprised him. Rosalie paused. She looked down at the burn scar as if she had forgotten it was there. "The flue in the library. When we first cleared it, a burning rook's nest fell back down the chimney. It caught the edge of a rug. I had to drag the rug out into the snow before it took the floorboards." She said it casually, as if dragging burning rugs was simply part of the curriculum for a duke's daughter. "You should not be doing manual labor," Arthur said, his aristocratic conditioning flaring up. "You are the Duchess of Westford. You have staff for that." Rosalie threw the cloth down on the table. The sound cracked like a whip in the quiet kitchen. She leaned forward, placing both of those ruined, calloused hands flat on the wood. She looked him dead in the eyes, and for the first time, Arthur saw the sheer, unadulterated steel beneath her practical exterior. "I had 2 elderly, starving servants when you dumped me here, Arthur," she said, her voice dangerously low. "I had a roof that let the rain pour onto my bed. I had an empty larder and 0 credit in the village. Do not sit in a chair that I bought, eating food that I paid for by selling my dead mother's pearls, and lecture me on what a duchess should do." Arthur stopped chewing. He stared at her. "I worked," she continued, her eyes blazing, "because the alternative was freezing to death in a silk dress while waiting for a husband who was never going to come. I chose to live. If that offends your sensibilities, you may return to London." The silence in the kitchen stretched, heavy and taut. Arthur looked at the fire in her eyes. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by women who manipulated with tears, with coy smiles, with calculated whispers behind fans. Rosalie was doing none of that. She was a raw, exposed nerve. She was furious, she was proud, and she was entirely in the right. He slowly lowered his spoon. He didn't shout. He didn't pull rank. He leaned back in the chair and looked around the kitchen. The warmth, the smell of the herbs, the absolute, undeniable proof of her labor. "I am not returning to London," Arthur said quietly. Rosalie narrowed her eyes, deeply suspicious of his calm. "Why are you here, Your Grace?" Arthur looked down at his own hands, smooth, clean, entirely useless. "I received your letters," he said. He met her gaze again, stripping away the boredom he usually wore like armor. "I read about the roofs, the wood, the stone. I sat in a house in Mayfair that's worth 20 times what this ruin is, and I realized—" He paused, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. "I realized that you had built a home," Arthur said softly, "and I have never had one." Rosalie stared at him. The anger in her posture didn't vanish, but it shifted, replaced by a cautious, calculating bewilderment. She looked at the scar through his eyebrow, the shadow of exhaustion under his eyes. For a brief second, she didn't see the tyrant who had banished her. She saw a profoundly empty man. "The blue room is at the end of the east corridor," Rosalie said finally, her voice neutral. She picked up her cloth. "The bed is aired. Breakfast is at dawn. We do not sleep late at Oakhaven. There's too much work to do." She turned her back to him and went to scrub the iron sink. Arthur sat at the table. He finished his stew. For the first time in his life, he felt a spark of genuine terror, not of violence or debt or societal ruin. He was terrified because he realized he was standing in the domain of a queen, and he had no idea how to earn his place in it. Arthur awoke to a sound he had not heard since his days in the cavalry. Absolute, bone-rattling silence. In London, the mornings were an orchestra of street vendors, carriage wheels, and the soft, urgent whispers of servants navigating the hallways. Here, there was only the wind scraping against the thick glass of the mullioned windows. He lay under a mountain of wool blankets. The air in the room was brutally cold, though the ashes in the grate still radiated a faint, stubborn heat. He waited for his valet. He lay there for 10 minutes, watching his breath plume white in the air, expecting a man with a silver tray of hot tea and an ironed shirt. Then he remembered where he was. He was at Oakhaven. Valets did not exist here. Survival existed here. Arthur threw off the blankets. The shock of the cold air hit him like a physical blow. He moved quickly, stripping off his fine linen nightshirt and pulling on his woolen trousers, his heavy riding boots, and a thick dark sweater. He did not bother with a cravat. He left his tailored coat hanging on the back of the door. When he reached the kitchen, the sun was barely bleeding over the horizon, painting the moors in bruised shades of violet and gray. The kitchen was already a hive of industry. Marcus was dragging a sack of flour from the pantry. Jane, the younger maid, was violently scrubbing a cast-iron skillet. Rosalie stood by the large wooden table, a mug of steaming tea in one hand, dictating a list to Peter, a gangly local boy who looked terrified to be in the same room as a duke. "Tell Higgins we need the hinges by Thursday," Rosalie was saying, her voice brisk. "If he says the ironmonger in York is delayed, tell him I will ride down and speak to the man myself. Go." Peter bolted. He nearly collided with Arthur in the doorway, stammered a frantic apology, and vanished into the cold morning. Rosalie turned. She looked at Arthur, taking in his lack of cravat, his unkempt hair, and the dark sweater. She didn't comment on it. She simply nudged a tin mug across the table and pointed to a blackened kettle resting on the stove. "Pour it yourself," she said. "There is porridge in the pot." Arthur walked to the stove. He poured the tea. It was black, harsh, and tasted faintly of smoke. It was exactly what he needed. He ate a bowl of thick, unseasoned oats standing up, watching his wife. "What is the schedule for today?" Arthur asked. Rosalie stopped wiping down her clipboard. She looked at him, her dark eyes narrowing with pure suspicion. The schedule? The tasks, the work. What is being done today? Graham and his sons are coming up from the village to repair the southern courtyard wall. It collapsed in October. Marcus is cleaning out the stables. I have to inventory the root cellar to ensure the rot hasn't spread to the potatoes. Why? I want to help, Arthur said. The silence that followed was heavy. Marcus stopped dragging the flour sack. Jane paused her scrubbing. Rosalie looked at him as if he had just announced his intention to sprout wings and fly out the window. You want to help, she repeated slowly. I have 2 hands. I am in reasonably good health. I can be of use. Rosalie let out a short, harsh laugh. It wasn't a cruel sound, but it was entirely devoid of amusement. Your Grace, you are a duke. The men coming from the village remember your father whipping a tenant farmer for failing to yield his cart on the road. If you go out into that courtyard, Graham and his boys will drop their trowels, stare at their feet, and accomplish absolutely nothing out of sheer terror. Stay in the library, read a book. It was a dismissal, cold, rational, and completely humiliating. Arthur set his empty bowl down. I am not asking your permission, Rosalie. It is my wall. I will help rebuild it. He walked out the back door into the biting frost before she could argue. The courtyard was a mess of shattered stone and frozen mud. 3 men were standing by a pile of rough-hewn rocks, mixing mortar in a large wooden trough. When Arthur approached, the conversation died instantly. The oldest man, Graham, a broad-shouldered mason with hands like hams, pulled off his cap. Your Grace, Graham muttered, his eyes glued to the dirt. Graham, Arthur said. He didn't use the aristocratic drawl he employed in Parliament. He used the voice of an officer addressing his sergeants, clear, level, expectant. Where do you need me? Graham blinked, looking up in sheer confusion. Pardon, Your Grace? The wall. It needs stones. Which ones need moving? Graham looked past Arthur, silently praying for Rosalie to appear and collect her mad husband. When she didn't, he pointed a thick, calloused finger toward a pile of heavy, jagged limestone blocks. We need the large ones moved to the base trench, sir. Arthur walked to the pile. He picked up a stone. It was shockingly heavy, its sharp edges biting instantly into his bare hands. He carried it to the trench and dropped it. He walked back. He picked up another. For the first hour, the masons worked in terrified, agonizing silence. They flinched every time Arthur grunted with effort. They expected him to quit. They expected him to throw a tantrum, blame them for the cold, and storm back inside. He didn't. By the second hour, the freezing wind had numbed Arthur's face. His muscles, unaccustomed to brutal, repetitive labor, began to scream. The rough limestone tore the skin on his palms, leaving streaks of red on the gray rock. He ignored it. He focused entirely on the rhythm: bend, lift, walk, drop. It was mindless, it was punishing, and it was exactly what he needed. For years, Arthur's mind had been a labyrinth of political debts, societal boredom, and self-loathing. Here, there was only the stone, the mortar, and the biting wind. Around noon, Graham paused. He watched Arthur drag a particularly massive block of stone across the freezing mud, his breath coming in ragged white plumes. Arthur's expensive boots were ruined. His sweater was caked in dirt. His hands were bleeding. Graham picked up a tin canteen of water. He walked over and held it out. Arthur stopped. He looked at the canteen, then at the mason. He took it, drank deeply, and handed it back. Heavy stone, that one, Graham said quietly. It's a bastard, Arthur agreed, wiping his mouth with the back of his dirty sleeve. Graham let out a short, rough chuckle. Aye, that it is. Best use the crowbar for the next one, Your Grace. Save your back. Arthur nodded. Thank you, Graham. From the window of the second-floor gallery, Rosalie stood perfectly still, watching the exchange. She had come up fully expecting to see Arthur shouting at the men, or perhaps retreating to the warmth of the fire. She watched her husband, the Duke of Westford, pick up an iron crowbar and wedge it under a rock, working shoulder to shoulder with a local mason. She looked at his bleeding hands. She frowned, her jaw tight, and turned away. The pain hit Arthur that night with the force of a carriage crash. He sat in a wooden chair in his bedchamber, staring at his hands in the flickering candlelight. The blisters had popped and filled with dirt. His lower back felt as though someone had taken an iron rod to it. He tried to unbutton his dirty shirt and his fingers cramped violently, refusing to obey. A soft knock broke the silence. The door pushed open before he could answer. Rosalie walked in. She carried a ceramic basin of steaming water, a clean linen towel, and a small jar of yellowish ointment. She wore her heavy woolen robe, her hair falling in a thick dark braid over her shoulder. She took one look at him, struggling with his buttons, and sighed. It wasn't an irritated sigh. It was practical. She set the basin on the small table next to him. Without a word, she batted his trembling hands away and unfastened the top 3 buttons of his shirt so he could breathe. "Put your hands in the water," she ordered. Arthur was too exhausted to argue. He submerged his hands in the basin. The water was laced with salt and something herbal that stung ferociously. He hissed through his teeth. "Keep them there," she said, pulling up a stool and sitting opposite him. They sat in silence for a long moment. The only sound was the crackle of the hearth and the wind howling against the stone walls outside. Arthur watched her. The harsh, defensive armor she wore during the day seemed slightly softer in the dim light. She looked tired. Her own hands rested in her lap, and he could see the scars and calluses that matched the ones he was currently forming. "Graham told me you moved 50 stones today," Rosalie said quietly, staring into the fire. "It felt like 500. He also said you didn't complain once." She finally looked at him. Her dark eyes were searching, trying to decipher a puzzle. "Why are you doing this, Arthur?" "Truly, you're a wealthy man. If you suddenly felt a pang of guilt over the state of this house, you could have sent a dozen foremen and an army of laborers from London. You didn't need to ruin your hands." Arthur looked down at the steaming water. "If I sent laborers, they would be working for a ghost. You said it yourself. And what are you?" "I'm trying to be a man," Rosalie scoffed softly. "You are a duke." "I'm beginning to realize," Arthur said, his voice thick with a raw, unfamiliar honesty, "that a title is just a coat. It covers the skin, but it doesn't change the bones beneath. My bones have been rotting for a long time, Rosalie." She didn't interrupt him. She simply listened, her expression unreadable. "When I married you," Arthur continued, forcing himself to meet her gaze, "I thought I was making a simple transaction, a debt paid, a duty fulfilled. I sent you here because I couldn't bear to look at the reality of what I had done. I bought a human being to satisfy my mother's dying wish, and then I buried that human being alive." Rosalie's jaw tightened. "Yes, you did." "I was a coward," Arthur said. The admission hung in the air, heavy and definitive. "I spent my days surrounded by sycophants who praised me because they feared my money. I drank, I gambled, I existed. And then, your letters started coming." Rosalie frowned. "They were bills of material, requests for nails. They were proof of life," Arthur countered softly. "They were proof that while I was rotting in a gilded cage of my own making, you were out here in the freezing rain, bringing a dead thing back to life. You were fighting. I wanted—" He swallowed hard. "I wanted to know what that felt like. I wanted to see the woman who had more steel in her spine than any man I had ever met." Rosalie stared at him. The protective ice she had built around herself, the ice forged in cold nights and bitter loneliness, cracked just a fraction. She didn't offer him a sweet smile. She didn't offer him absolution. She reached into the basin, took his right hand, and pulled it out of the water. She dried it with the rough linen towel. Her touch was not gentle, but it was incredibly precise. She opened the jar of ointment. It smelled of beeswax, pine resin, and raw mutton fat. She scooped a generous amount onto her fingers and began to work it into the torn skin of his palms. The pain was sharp, but the heat of her hands was grounding. "This will prevent infection," Rosalie said, her voice strictly clinical, though she didn't look up from his hand. "Tomorrow you will wear thick leather gloves. If you ruin your hands completely, you are useless to me, and I have no time to nurse a crippled duke." Arthur felt a tight, unexpected smile pull at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, Duchess." She moved to his left hand. Her thumb traced the edge of a particularly deep scrape near his wrist. She paused. "You do not get to come here and fix everything with a few days of hard labor, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You do not get to lift some stones and erase the 5 years I spent shivering in the dark." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for a clean slate. I'm asking for a shovel." Rosalie finally looked up. Her dark eyes locked onto his gray ones. The silence between them was no longer the empty void of a broken marriage. It was the charged, heavy quiet of two people standing on opposite sides of a bridge, waiting to see who would take the first step. She finished rubbing the ointment into his hand. She stood up, wiped her own hands on her apron, and picked up the basin. "Breakfast is at dawn," Rosalie said, walking toward the door. She paused with her hand on the iron latch. She didn't look back. "Graham wants to start the mortar before the sun thaws the ground. Do not be late." The door clicked shut. Arthur sat in the chair, his hands aching, his back throbbing, smelling strongly of pine resin and mutton fat. He looked at the closed door. For the first time in 5 years, he felt entirely, undeniably awake. January arrived not with a whisper, but with a roar. The weeks leading up to the deep freeze fundamentally altered the rhythm of Oakhaven. Arthur did not return to London. He did not ask for his velvet coats or his brandy. He worked. His physical transformation was slow, but absolute. The tailored shirts tore and were replaced by coarse, durable wool purchased from Higgins in the village. His smooth, aristocratic hands grew thick with calluses. The persistent, hollow exhaustion that had plagued him in Mayfair evaporated, replaced by the heavy, satisfying ache of a body used to its limits. He learned to mix mortar. He learned to split ash logs cleanly with a single strike of an iron wedge. He learned the names of Graham's children and the exact temper of Marcus's mule. And he learned Rosalie. He learned that she took her tea black, only after the rest of the household had eaten. He learned that she tapped her pencil against her thumb when she was worried about the price of coal. He learned that she commanded the household not through fear, but through absolute, unyielding competence. They did not speak of love. They did not share lingering, passionate glances across the courtyard. They shared ledgers. They sat on opposite ends of the heavy library table late into the night, the fire crackling between them, calculating the grain yield and the cost of replacing the lead flashing on the roof. It was a courtship of numbers, wood, and survival. Then, the storm hit. It was a Tuesday when the sky turned a sickly, bruised yellow. By dusk, the wind was screaming across the moors, carrying sheets of ice that rattled against the thick window panes like grape shot. The temperature plummeted so fast the stone walls of the castle groaned under the contracting cold. At midnight, Arthur was jolted awake by a tremendous splintering crack. He threw off his blankets, grabbed his boots and a heavy coat, and bolted down the dark corridor. He met Rosalie at the top of the grand staircase. She was carrying a lantern, her hair loose and whipping around her face from the drafts tearing through the hall. "The western barn," she said. Her voice was tight with real panic. "The roof hasn't been reinforced yet. The sheep are in there. So is Marcus's mule." Arthur didn't hesitate. "Stay here." "Like hell I will," she snapped, already moving past him toward the kitchen. When they pushed the heavy oak doors open, the wind nearly knocked them flat. The courtyard was a vortex of blinding white. Arthur grabbed Rosalie's arm, anchoring her against the gale, and they waded through knee-deep drifts toward the western outbuildings. The barn was a massive, ancient timber structure. Through the driving snow, Arthur could see the roof sagging violently under the weight of the ice. Another brutal gust of wind hit, and a sickening crack echoed over the storm. The main central beam was fracturing. Marcus was already there, frantically struggling to unlatch the frozen iron bar of the heavy barn doors. He was old, and the cold was sapping his strength. "Get the animals out!" Arthur roared over the wind. He shoved Marcus aside and slammed his shoulder against the wood, forcing the frozen doors inward. The inside of the barn was absolute chaos. The sheep were bleating in terror, huddled against the far wall. The mule was kicking violently at its stall. Above them, the massive oak beam groaned. Dust and splinters rained down. "The beam is going!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking. "We can't get him out in time!" Arthur looked up. The fracture in the wood was widening. If the roof fell, it would crush the animals. And to Rosalie, those animals weren't just livestock. They were the wool that paid for the plaster. They were the food that would keep the servants alive through March. They were the life she had built. Arthur ran toward the center of the barn. "Arthur, no!" Rosalie screamed from the doorway. He ignored her. He grabbed a massive 8-foot length of heavy timber they had been using to brace the stone walls, a beam meant to be lifted by 2 men. Adrenaline and raw, desperate necessity surged through his blood. He hoisted the timber upright, staggering under the crushing weight, and wedged it directly under the fracturing center beam. He wrapped his arms around the rough wood and planted his boots deep into the dirt floor. "Get them out," Arthur bellowed, his muscles screaming as the roof shifted, and the entire weight of the snow-laden structure settled onto the single timber he was holding. Now, Marcus and Rosalie moved like lightning. They drove the panicked sheep out into the storm toward the safety of the eastern stone stables. Marcus blindfolded the thrashing mule with his own scarf and dragged it out by the halter. Arthur's boots slid an inch in the dirt. The pressure from above was immense. He felt the fibers in his shoulders tearing. The rough wood bit through his coat, scraping his cheek raw. The cold vanished, replaced by a blinding, white-hot agony in his back and arms. He looked toward the door. Rosalie was standing there. The last sheep had bolted past her. "Drop it and run," she screamed. Arthur pushed upward with every ounce of strength he possessed, violently shoving the support timber an inch higher to buy himself a fraction of a second. Then he let go and dove toward the snow. Behind him, the central beam snapped with the sound of a cannon shot. The roof caved in, burying the interior of the barn under tons of slate, rotting wood, and ice. The shockwave of displaced air and snow threw Arthur forward, sending him crashing hard onto the frozen cobblestones of the courtyard. Everything went dark for a moment. When Arthur opened his eyes, the storm was still howling, but someone was hauling him up by the collar of his coat. It was Rosalie. She was on her knees in the snow, her hands gripping him with a desperate, crushing strength. "Can you walk?" she demanded. Her face was pale, her dark eyes wide and terrified. Arthur groaned, pushing himself up onto his elbows. His shoulder felt as though it had been struck by a hammer, and blood was running warmly down his cheek from a gash near his temple. But nothing felt broken. "I can walk," he rasped. She threw his heavy arm over her shoulder, bearing his weight. Together, they limped back across the blinding courtyard, leaving the ruined barn behind them. The kitchen was stiflingly hot, a sharp contrast to the freezing hell outside. Arthur sat shirtless on a wooden stool near the hearth. His torso was a canvas of bruises, the skin of his right shoulder turning a vivid, ugly purple. The gash on his cheek had stopped bleeding, but his back throbbed with a relentless, sickening ache. Rosalie stood behind him. She held a cloth soaked in hot water and arnica. She pressed the hot cloth gently against his bruised shoulder. Arthur flinched, drawing a sharp breath through his teeth. "Hold still," she murmured. The anger was gone from her voice. The cold, practical detachment she had wielded like a shield for months had shattered completely in the snow. Her hands, rough and calloused, were incredibly gentle as they moved over his battered skin. "You are an idiot," Rosalie said quietly into the quiet room. The storm raged outside, but inside, the silence was heavy and intimate. "You could have been killed over a flock of sheep." "They aren't just sheep," Arthur said. His voice was rough, exhausted. He stared into the glowing embers of the fire. "They are your independence. I wasn't going to let the winter take what you fought so hard to build." Rosalie's hands paused. She stood behind him, staring at the scarred, bruised expanse of his back. This was the back of a duke who had spent his life draped in velvet, who had chosen to stand under a collapsing roof to save a peasant's mule and a half-dozen sheep. She walked around to the front of the stool. She didn't look at his wounds. She looked at his face. Arthur met her gaze. He was stripped bare, physically and emotionally. the arrogance that had defined his youth, the cynical detachment he had used to survive London, the guilt that had driven him to Yorkshire. All of it was gone. He was just a man, deeply tired, sitting by a fire. "Rosalie," Arthur said softly, "I cannot undo St. George's. I cannot give you back the 5 years I stole from you. If you want me to leave, if the sight of me in this house is a burden to you, say the word, and I will be gone by morning." He meant it. He would walk out into the snow if she asked him to. Rosalie looked at him. She thought of the terrified girl she had been, abandoned in a decaying tomb. She thought of the blisters, the weeping in the dark, the pure, feral anger that had kept her alive. She had hated him. She had built this fortress to keep the world out, including him. But she looked at the man in front of her now. The man who hauled stone alongside the villagers, the man who ate plain porridge without complaint, the man who had just risked his life for her home. She reached out. Her fingers, rough and scarred, traced the line of his jaw, stopping just below the fresh bleeding scrape on his cheek. "You gave me an empty castle, Arthur," Rosalie said. Her voice trembled just slightly, betraying the immense well of emotion she had suppressed for so long. "I hated you for it, but it forced me to find out exactly who I was." Arthur leaned into her touch. It was the first time she had touched him with affection. It felt like walking into the sun. "And who are you?" he whispered. "I'm the woman who rebuilt Oakhaven," Rosalie said, her eyes fierce and bright with unshed tears. "And I do not build things just to cast them out." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Arthur reached up, his large, bruised hands gently gripping her waist. "You do not get to leave, Arthur," Rosalie told him, her voice dropping to a fierce, possessive whisper. "You broke your back for this house. You bled in its dirt. You belong to it now. You belong to me." Arthur let out a breath that sounded like a ragged sob. He pulled her down, burying his face in the warmth of her neck, his arms wrapped around her, pulling her against his chest as if she were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Rosalie held him. She ran her hands through his unkempt hair, resting her chin on the top of his head. The wind howled against the stone walls of the castle, a furious, bitter entity trying to tear them down. But the walls held. The stones were strong, the mortar was fresh, and the fire in the hearth roared with unyielding life. They stayed like that for a long time, anchored to each other in the warmth of the kitchen. Arthur had not given her a home. He had given her a ruin. But out of the dust and the freezing rain, Rosalie had forged a sanctuary, and in the process, she had forged a man worthy of standing beside her in it. The Duke of Westford had finally come home. True love isn't found in perfect ballrooms. It's built from the ground up, stone by stone, through grit, forgiveness, and shared survival. Rosalie and Arthur proved that the strongest bonds are forged when we strip away our titles and fight for the home we believe in. If you loved this deeply emotional journey of resilience and redemption, please like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to the channel for more grounded historical romances. The walls of Oakhaven stand strong, and so does their love. See you in the next story.